I want to bring in another friend of mine, Chine McDonald, who is the director of Theos. And before we get into the kind of practical details, I just want to take one little step back. This is a really interesting moment. As a culture, we've had all sorts of things happen in quite quick succession. We had a global pandemic. We had the George Floyd death and the kind of spike in interest in race and integration. We had the Afghan resettlement. We've had the Hong Kong movement. And we've got this kind of nationalities and borders bill going through. And now we've got the Ukrainian refugee crisis. And as someone whose job it is to kind of help the church kind of navigate this great cultural spaghetti moment that we're in, I'd love, Chine, for you to give us just a little bit of a step back and understand what you're seeing kind of culturally and what this could mean for the church.
Thanks, Krish, and thanks for the opportunity to speak into this as well. And also just wanted to thank you for all that you're doing. I know that it's at great cost. I know that you're hardly sleeping. I know that you're really busy, but just thank you for all that you're doing to kind of bring the church together. So as you were saying, this crisis is hugely significant on so many different levels, for us as individuals, but for us as a nation, but also thinking globally. So yes, before we kind of start thinking about the practical of the churches doing kind of things locally and practically to help, let's take a step back and think about the context in which we're doing this. So I think about as individuals, I am a geriatric millennial, and my generation and those older than us, and obviously those younger than us, have had to think recently about our own mortality in ways that we hadn't had to before, especially coming out of a global pandemic and having grown up in relative peace, although recognizing that conflicts have been raging elsewhere around the world, and not forgetting our own roles as a nation in wars in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. These have always felt like they've been far away from us. So war in Europe requires us to put ourselves in the shoes of those people who we perceive to be like us, and ask, what would it be like for us to go through such unimaginable horror? And perhaps part of the significance, or I think my hope at least, is that following this conflict, when it comes to an end, we will stretch this understanding of who we believe to be people like us. As Christians, surely we believe that everyone is part of God's family, including those that are far away from us. So yes, we should absolutely care about those in Ukraine, but as you mentioned at the start, we should also kind of be welcoming to those from other areas of conflict as well, who are fleeing kind of conflict and persecution. And then there's the context for us as a nation. So post-Brexit, we were wrestling with questions about our own identity as a nation. Do we see ourselves as part of Europe when it comes down to it, or in some way separate? So it's been absolutely amazing to see that 150,000 people have stepped forward to welcome Ukrainian refugees. And we as a nation will have to wrestle with our own sense of identity. Will we be a nation that welcomes refugees open-heartedly? Will attitudes to immigration shift? Or will the arguments, the anxiety around this idea of economic migrants gaming the system persist? Well, I think it's really ironic that all of this is happening, all this kind of generosity, hospitality, and this kind of open-heartedness is happening at a time when the Nationality and Borders Bill is making its way through Parliament. And it's likely that the crisis will affect our economy as well. How much are Brits going to tolerate in terms of increased fuel prices and cost of living as far as it relates to this particular crisis? There are going to be some difficult political choices and economic choices that are going to have to be made. Will we see an increase in our defence budget from its current 2% to something more like the 6% that it was in the 1960s? And what are the implications of doing that for those living in poverty in the UK, but also those living overseas? What effect will it have on the aid budget? And in all of this, what should the voice of the church be? What should we be saying? What should our posture be? And then thinking about a global scale and a geopolitical scale, it's remarkable to see how much can change so quickly, even in these past few weeks since the Ukraine war started. And we've obviously all been asking ourselves lots of big questions. And at Theos, we like big questions. There's been an obvious shift of power and influence away from liberal democracies towards autocracies and authoritarian regimes. And all of this has kind of led to a sense of identity crisis, perhaps, or a blow to this Western idea of and the myth of progress, that the march of civilization is irreversible, that we're kind of heading somewhere. And this has shaken our foundations, the things that we thought we knew. The West as a whole is having to think about what it is for, what it stands for, how unified it needs to be. What is it that we, as the West, would fight to defend? And then as the church, in all of these questions, we're asking ourselves where we can make a tangible and practical difference for such a time as this. And one of the really practical examples I just want to mention I've come across is how Bible Society, for example, are helping provide Bible-based trauma resources and free Bibles for Ukrainian refugees. And there are all sorts of practical ways in which the church is helping. But in all of this, we need to always stand for our values and recognize that actually the church's values aren't synonymous necessarily with the West values. We need to be willing to challenge some perceptions about society and ask ourselves, how can our voice as the church be one of kindness and generosity and open-heartedness and love, rather than fear and protectionism and exclusion of the so-called other. So these are some of the questions that we've been asking, kind of zooming back, zooming out, looking at the kind of broader context.
Thank you, Chine. That's so helpful, because in the rush, we could lose what's happening in the wider context. But I guess from what you're saying, it makes what the church is mobilizing to do even more significant. I've been chatting to people. I'm an extrovert, so I've been chatting to people on the train into work. And people have been saying it's a little bit like a 9/11 moment. That sense of, you know, who am I? What's going on? My whole world's been turned upside down. There's a war in Europe with a nuclear power who has the potential to unleash chemical weapons. This is, for my generation, this is all our disaster movies rolled into one. And people are very open, actually. And I found working alongside people that don't share faith to help these vulnerable people has unlocked all sorts of really interesting spiritual conversations. So people often say, you know, Christians, you know, should care about evangelism or we should care about social justice, but these two things often go hand in hand. It's as people see the church respond to this social need that the message that we share shines even more brightly. So you've really helped us put it in a wider context. We're really grateful for you, and thanks for the work of Theos and Bible Society. It's been great to have you on today. Thank you.